It's lovely to see you. I appreciate you doing this. It is always a pleasure and a privilege to get to talk to you. I wanted to ask you off the jump how you decided to put this together and why. There's 125 pieces. It spans your career. It includes awards. It includes statues. It includes comics. It includes artwork. It includes books. It is a treasure trove for those who adore and idolize and revere Neil Gaiman. How did you decide what pieces to include in the auction?
So it all began with Jeff Notkin. And Jeffrey Notkin, we were at school together. We've known each other since we were kids. He was the drummer in my punk band. Later on, I became incredibly jealous of Jeff when I was working as a young journalist in the UK, and Jeff was at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, working with Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eisner. He was Art Spiegelman's and Françoise Mouly's assistant editor on Raw. He was doing all this amazing comic stuff. And I looked at Jeff and thought, oh, I want to be you. I want to do the comic stuff. And then Jeff actually wandered off into this. He never really stayed in comics. He moved off and eventually became a meteorite man and took his love of meteorites and made that into his career and into his life. And he wound up with this amazing meteorite collection and a TV show about hunting for meteorites.
Right.
He had Emmys and stuff like that. And Jeff, a couple of years ago, called me and said, I'm going to be doing an auction. Will you help me promote my auction? He said, I've got all of this amazing stuff in my house, and I just think it would be great to get it out into the world. I'm now in my early 60s, and I'm going to get stuff out into the world. It's going to do good for charity. And I said, of course I'll help. So I used my social media to help push Jeff's auction. And I just remember looking at his catalog, because I got my Heritage Auction catalog of Jeffrey's. And I looked at it and I'm like, this is amazing. You are taking the treasures, you're taking all of this stuff you have and you're sending it out into the world. And I said, why? And Jeffrey said, well, it's going to make other people a lot happier. Then, it's been making me happy. These things have been making me happy for 20, 30, 40 years. But if they go out now, somebody can look at this thing and go, I'm owning this piece of this meteorite. I'm owning this thing. And they'll get joy again. And it's going to do good for charity. He said, you should do something like this. And it was Jeff. And he just I'm like, no, that sounds complicated. And then Jeffrey kept saying, no, I'll introduce you to the people at Heritage who I work with on my auction. It's been great. It did really good things. And I said, well, okay. And so, awkward email conversations began with me going, I'm not sure if this is a good idea, but I loved the idea of getting stuff that I've had for a long time out into the world. So that was sort of where it began.
Well, it's interesting.
Sorry.
It's an interesting thing. I've talked to many collectors since I've been here in the last 4 years. And it's always a very interesting discussion about how when you have a thing or many things that you love and have brought you joy, that there comes a point where you're aware, no matter your connection to that thing, that you are but a temporary custodian and caretaker of that thing.
You don't own the stuff. You are looking after the stuff until the next people get the stuff. And which is also one reason why I thought, okay, I will actually make sure that anything that goes out from me has a little signed, this is from Neil Gaiman's collection thing, because that's part of the story. You're selling people, you're giving people the artwork, you're giving people the collectibles, but you're also giving them the story. This is who this thing is. This is how you got this thing. you know, behind you. Each of those pieces of art behind you, for me, is a story. And it's the story of how I got it. It's the story of what it meant to me. And I sort of want to try and pass some of those on as well.
So as you were putting together the 125 pieces that are in the auction, was it with the approach of, all right, I'm not just going to get rid of things that I no longer enjoy looking at or that I have wrung the joy from. Maybe I will put together a narrative of my story using these pieces, beginning, you know, I've got Watchmen right here. Obviously, that is something that you had a hand in. You helped Alan track down quotes. You are certainly part of it. Your name is at the front of Watchmen. It is in a, you know, a Swamp Thing over here. These are certainly things that inspired you, things that drove you, and things that made you the writer and the comic book writer and the novelist that you have become.
Absolutely. Swamp Thing was the thing that got me back into comics. I had walked away from comics, nothing but Will Eisner. I still kept all my Will Eisner. I kept reading Will, but apart from that, I was done. I'd gone. I was 17. I'd outgrown comics. And when I was 22, 23, I started picking up Swamp Thing on Victoria Station, the newsagents. They had a pile of comics. I flipped through it, and I'd loved Swamp Thing when I was a kid, and I looked at it, and I'd read it and put it back. It took me like 3 months of inertia to actually go, I'm going to buy my first comic in years.
Why were you so resistant to it?
I think partly I was resistant in the manner of somebody who knows that there is no getting slightly back into comics. If I let this thing back into my heart, I was lost. And of course I was. And I bought my first Swamp Thing, and I was in love. It was like everything that I'd imagined you could do with the power of imagery of comics that I'd hoped you could do when I was a teenager. I was seeing Alan and Steve and John and their collaborators start bringing to Swamp Thing, bringing to the page. So, you know, it's the first time I could actually afford original comics art, because I was a very impecunious young journalist. But I remember going down to Comics Showcase in Neal Street, as it was back then in Covent Garden, and buying my first Swamp Thing page, and just being so proud that I owned a piece of original art by these people whose work I loved and revered. And with Watchmen, I was just honored to be a part of it. Alan would phone me and ask for pointers, normally titling episodes, and I'd go off and find him something. And I found him just various bits. Every now and then I'd come across something, you know, an article on owls from 1911. I go, this feels like it's right, or information. I'd give it to Alan, and as a result of which I was one of the people it was dedicated to, which meant the world. And Dave and Alan gave me a page, and I love the fact that the page they gave me, is the only 18-panel page, technically 17-panel page, in the whole of Watchmen. All of these tiny panels. B, it's about dreams. And I was going to go on and do Sandman, but nobody knew that then. So it's one of these glorious Watchmen coincidences, these Watchmen things, you know, Watchmen serendipity swirls around Watchmen. And I just love the fact I look at it and I go, oh, this is the dream. You gave me the dream. And I took that and kept moving. And that was, a year, 2 years before ever Sandman happened. And also, I love the fact that one of the panels on my page has become, in many ways, the most iconic of Watchmen images, which is the skeletons embracing. I've seen people with that tattooed on them. I've seen, that image has gone off around the world. And I would look at this page and go, every time I look at that page, it brings me joy, unmitigated, absolute and utter joy. And and John Higgins gave me his color guide to it as well. So I have the original art and I have the color guide. And that page, I think, more than anything, weirdly, was kind of the tipping point into this auction. Because I thought I have had now almost 40 years of joy from this. And I just loved the idea of somebody else getting to be its custodian. Somebody else out there for whom that page matters as much as it matters to me. And knowing that there are people out there. I'm an art collector. I love buying art. I love finding strange things, and there's always that weird feeling of gratitude toward the person who said, I'm going to let this one back into the wild. And I bought from a heritage auction a couple of years ago this amazing Winsor Mackay editorial cartoon. And I loved that Darren Shan let it back out into the wild, because that meant that now it's on my wall and it'll stay on my wall for a few years or for my lifetime, and then it will go somewhere else.
And the amazing part of that all is that everybody gets joy out of it for a different reason. You have a very profoundly personal connection to it. Your connection to it, your affiliation, your association with it infuses that art, not just Alan and Dave's work, but it infuses all of it as well. So when somebody takes it, you have added another layer to that narrative and to that enjoyment of that piece.
I would love that. As I say, I love the idea that anybody buying the art is also buying the story.
It's interesting because I as you talk about this page from Watchmen and sort of how it served as a springboard and an inspiration in Alan's work on Swamp Thing, it begins the narrative that leads us into the Sandman and what came after that. And I sort of wonder, as you're putting together the auction and gathering the items, is it a thing where are you acutely aware of the autobiography that you are offering in a catalog? Because, you touch upon many of the things that you have done throughout your career. I think the only thing that's probably missing from this auction is a signed copy of the Duran Duran book.
Could have done. I only have. There's a level on which, when it comes to the things that are more like the books and memorabilia, I would always make sure that I kept something for myself. And when it comes to the Duran Duran book, I have one hardback edition of the Duran Duran book. I didn't know, when I was the author, I didn't even know these things existed. It will be another 15 years after the book came out. The publisher went into involuntary bankruptcy about 15 minutes after it was published. And somewhere around 1999, that was 1984, 1999-ish, I saw my first hardcover copy of the Duran Duran book. I discovered they'd been printed for the American library market, and a few of them had gone out, and I'd never even known this thing existed. So it was very much the rarest of the rare. And I wound up paying, I think, something ridiculous, like $800 for one copy, the only other copy I've ever seen. And I have it just so that I have one hardcover copy of my first book. And that is not going in the auction. That stays with me because it's, I don't know, maybe if I do another auction in a few years' time and I go, yes, it is time for you to go, my child. But I liked the fact that with things that I was letting go, I let everything go that I've let go with an open heart, as it were. If there was any doubt at all about whether or not I was going to let it go, I would. If there was even a shade of, do I still want this? Am I good with this? What do I think? I would say, no, that stays. And anything which made me feel good, anything that's going, goes with my blessing, goes with my love. It doesn't go with regret or with a wish that I was keeping it.
I would have thought sitting behind me, the Moebius piece was one that you would have had, because that's a piece you bought. That's a piece.
It is. I love that piece so much. I fell in love with Moebius when I was about 13 years old on a French exchange. I'd gone to Paris, and the very first issue of Metal Hurlant was out. And I bought very bravely, with my saved up money, brought my copies of Metal Hurlant back, which would later sort of become heavy metal. And I was in love with Moebius. I couldn't read the stories. My French wasn't good enough, but I was in love with this thing. And later, one of my dreams was always to have Moebius illustrate a story that I wrote. And I actually wrote a story in Endless Nights for Moebius to draw. And he got back to me and said, I don't think I'm in good enough physical shape to draw this. Could you do me something smaller? And I wrote another story for him in Endless Nights that was smaller and more poster-like. And he said, actually, my health is going. And right. Indeed, it was. But that piece he did in 1995 or 96 for an endless gallery, and it was sold. It was up for sale at the Four Color Images gallery in New York, a very short-lived, much missed art gallery they went, comics are art, we're going to put this stuff on our walls. And I bought it. It was the only piece I bought. And a lot of it was always this feeling that I shouldn't go in and cherry pick. I should allow stuff to collectors. But with that one, it's like, no, it's Moebius. I am buying that. And since 1996, it's been hanging on my wall, and I walk past it, and it makes me smile every time I see it. And in fact, there was a point where DC Comics decided to make a poster of that, which is really weird because the poster is enormous. Right. It's huge. And when you see the piece, it's tiny. It's blown up like 2 or 3 times to become poster size. And yet I go, oh, I love it. I love it so much, that piece. But there are so many Moebius fans out there, and there are so many people out there who love death. And I think it would bring incredible amount of joy to the world. And it's, people have told me that I love the feedback that I'm getting from people who are just going through the heritage auction offices, and I'll get texts from people saying, I saw this, it's amazing. And that brings me joy. And that Moebius piece for me is one of those.
Did you know when you went to the gallery that that piece existed?
Yes, I did. But I went to the gallery to do a signing
Right.
for them that was part of the Sandman, was it the Sandman Gallery or the Endless Gallery? It was one of those gallery comics that we did, and it tied in. They had an exhibition there, just as later they did a Mr. Punch exhibition. They were wonderful people, and but I do remember just walking around and looking at all of these pieces of art and going, I love this. This is so beautiful. And then going, Moebius. I'm gonna own a Moebius, and I did.
Going back to the narrative of the auction, to putting it together, because it's always fascinating to me as someone who's read your stuff from the beginning, and obviously got a Miracleman piece behind me as well. So I assume that as you're putting it together, it's all right. Did you feel like you needed to have pieces from each chapter of your career?
Yes, I did. There were definitely a few pieces that I looked at and went, you are only going out there because you are a marker in some way. But there was also a feeling that, I have this very huge, very odd career in that, with a lot of people, you could put a word in the middle of their name that would explain who they are. Douglas, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Adams, or whatever. And people go, okay, yes, that's it. And with me, it could be Neil Sandman Gaiman, but it could just easily be Neil Coraline Gaiman, or Neil Good Omens Gaiman, or Neil, there's things that you can put in there. So there was definitely a desire to try and represent some of those things. But it was always sort of weirdly balanced with joy. I'd look at the art and go, I love this thing. Would it bring people joy? And there's odd bits of my career that are represented. The couple of drawings from Larry Welts that had to do with cherry Pop-Tart, where he gave me a drawing to try and persuade me, I think, to do a cherry story for him. And I loved the drawing he gave me. It was so cute. And then a friend of mine talked me into writing a cherry story for him. And I was like, I can't do this. I'm not very good at porn stuff. It's very embarrassing, but I'll write the story anyway. And I love the story. I look back on it and go, it was so cute. It was so sweet. And my friend Kate Worley and I were meant to be doing it together. I thought she can write the sex bit and then I'll do the thing. And once I wrote the story and gave it to her, it was like, you can do the sex. She's like, no, you've written a story. It's fine. Just give it to Larry. And so I love the fact that there's the cover and there's the beautiful drawing that he did for me. And it's a little bit of something cute and silly. But it's also a part of my career that I love that it exists. I love that there's trying to get a lot of Sandman represented. Partly, I think, because there's a weirdness for me in Sandman, in that, on the one hand, Sandman is a thing that I was doing from 1987 until 1996 full time, and then occasionally afterwards and so forth. But Sandman then came back, and we've been making Sandman television industriously since 2019. And I go to bed too late every night these days, because the last thing I do before bed is I sit and watch the dailies from the Sandman shoot. Right now, that I don't know if I can get into, if I'll get into trouble for saying this, but right now I'm seeing an awful lot of Season of Mists stuff coming through, and it's amazing. I'm watching all of this stuff that I wrote 35, 36, 37 years ago, and it's now happening on the screen, and it's amazing. So there's a level on which it feels like Sandman's come round again, and I don't feel like I'm bringing out something historical. I feel like I'm bringing out something that is peculiarly present.
Well, I mean, that's, as I was looking through it, I was thinking, should there have been more Sandman? Should there have been less Sandman? Is this the right amount of Sandman? Is this, and I'm just speaking as a fan, as someone who admires the work and has for, 37 years, because it is amazing. I remember talking to Karen Berger about this several years ago, many years ago, about the fact that it sold better 10, 20 years after its publication than it did when it began publication. It sold, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that you are the reason trade paperbacks exist. You are, so it has always been interesting to me to see the lingering impact of and the growing fondness for Sandman over the course of the last 25, 30 years.
Back in 2002, I sat down with Paul Levitz because we got interested in a conversation and tried to work out, from the money that it has brought in reprint form, if you assigned that and the readership and the sale, it wasn't even the money, it was much more the sales and the numbers. If you assigned those numbers back to the original comic, what it would have sold during its time. As Sandman, we were selling our 48,000 copies a month, and we're very proud of ourselves back then. And back in 2002, we worked out that we would have been selling about 4 million copies an issue to get to where we were. And it's only got bigger since then. So right now you go, well, it probably would have been about 10 million copies an issue. So we were quietly and unknowingly the best-selling comic of our era, despite only selling, at the time, our 48,000 copies an issue. I love the fact that the influence that the Sandman has had is outsized. And some of the pieces that I get to bring to the world on that, for me, the two, I guess, some of the most important ones would be two Mike Dringenberg pieces, one of which he did as a promotion for a signing that he and I were doing at his local comic store in Utah, and that's a portrait of Morpheus by Mike Dringenberg that nobody's ever seen before, except reproduced on the flyer for the people who went to that store signing in 1989. And then an incredibly beautiful death piece that he did, and that nobody's ever seen. It just hung, he did it, he gave it to me, it hung on my wall, and I would look at it, this multimedia piece with flower petals and this amazing death piece. And I look at those and I think Mike was utterly the quintessential Sandman artist. In many ways, there was never anybody to touch him. His Sandman really defined the look and the feel of the character. And Mike, and I got incredibly pleased when I saw you guys auctioned off his original drawing, the first published Sandman drawing, which was his "I Will Show You Fear in a Handful of Dust." Terror. The DC legal department changed it from fear to terror. They were terrified of being sued by T.S. Eliot. And that ad, which went for something ridiculous. I remember that, people just went, this is pure Dringenberg, and it's so beautiful and so absolutely Sandman. And I also look at one of the pieces that I decided to let out, and it took a little bit of heart searching. Did I want? I thought, yes, I do. I want it to go. Is there were very, very few double page spreads in Sandman. I was acutely conscious while I was writing Sandman that every panel counted. I had 24 pages. If I was going to do a double page spread, I needed a huge reason for it. There are almost none. There's a couple in Season of Mist where I needed to show the vastness of hell and the gates. But one of them that I always looked forward to doing was the double page spread of the Sea Serpent, because I knew it had to be huge in order to work. And Michael Zulli gave me that Sea Serpent, drawn by him, inked by the amazing Dick Giordano, who was a friend and a legend. And I thought, okay, that for me is one of those magical Sandman pieces.
I want to go back to two things that you said a moment ago. You don't say let go of when you talk about these pieces. You say let out. And that to me is a very different way to say it. I mean, it is as though you are setting them free.
Weirdly, that's actually, I hadn't stopped to think about that, but that is kind of how I feel about them. There's just this feeling that there are things that I want them to go out and find their people, to get the joy that I get every now and then when I find a piece of artwork out there, and I suddenly feel like this has come to me. This has come to me from my wall for a little while, and one day I will let it go. But for now, I've got some of the proudest things I have on my wall right now are an E.H. Shepard, Winnie the Pooh and Piglet walking in the snow, and I was incredibly lucky to get it. I paid a fraction of what I should have done for it, because it went up for auction in a tiny little place in Arizona, and for whatever reason the E.H. Shepard people didn't notice, and I did, and I got it, and I love it, and I right now could not imagine letting it go, because I get so much joy. Anybody who comes to this house is walked in front of it, and they have to appreciate it, whether they appreciate it or not. But there will come a time when it's like, okay, your turn, go back out into the world, let somebody else do this thing that I did.
The other thing that came to me while you were talking about all of this is what these pieces bring to you outside of simply the joy. As someone, when you write and begin to see Dringenberg or Jill Thompson or all of these artists give shape to your voice and your imagination. Because I think back to when Alan Moore initially kind of taught you how to write a comic book script. You're putting words on a paper, you're trying to understand sort of the form. And then when you hand it off to somebody else who becomes not simply a trusted or admired collaborator, but they become an interpreter and a sort of second voice in that conversation with you and with the audience. I wonder, as you surround yourself with pieces of your own that have been interpreted by others, what inspiration they provide to you and what direction they push you in or toward throughout the course of writing Sandman and everything that comes after. I think about Charles Vess's work on Stardust. I think about all of these other things as well. And you begin to see your words become tangible on that page.
Yeah. I always been drawn to art. I think it's one reason why I loved working in comics. Is I can write my words. My words don't excite me. I wrote them. I can write my words, give them to an artist, and get a page back or a finished comic back and look at it, and I'm so thrilled. This is the best thing in the world. This is not what I was expecting. It's what I was hoping for. It was what I was dreaming for. It's my world seen through other eyes. Charles Vess, Stardust would not have existed without Charles Vess. I wrote it with this idea of, I want to see Charles draw this. I wrote things that were simply written because I knew that Charles was going to draw something amazing. And he did. Charles, for my money, is the most interesting of the sort of fairy artists since Arthur Rackham. And I think we were just incredibly lucky to have him in comics. I was so lucky to have him on Sandman, and we won. We're in where were we? Tucson, Arizona. We won the World Fantasy Award for Sandman 19, Midsummer Night's Dream, as best short story. And that night, I went to Charles and said, I've got this idea for this story about this star that falls and this guy who falls in love with it, a guy who promises his beloved that he will bring it back, and he goes, and I told him the story. I said, are you in? And he said, yes, I'm in. And that was Stardust. It was done for Charles. And I always felt when I was writing Sandman that everything I was writing was being written for my collaborator, was being written for the people I was working with. And then what I would get back from them would be joy.
Over the course of those 2,000 pages of the initial Sandman, did you get back pieces of art that changed your direction of, or your understanding of, or your appreciation for the characters that you had created?
Only one, but that was huge.
Yeah.
Really was only one that made me go, oh, it's going to be this thing. And that was right in the beginning. I'd written the outline for Sandman. I'd written the first couple of episodes, the first 2 or 3 scripts. And in the outline, Death was going to look a lot like Nico from the Velvet Underground. I think I was going back and forth. I talked about Louise Brooks, but then I decided I was going to use Louise Brooks over in Books of Magic as Rose Occult. So it was going to be Nico from the Velvet Underground. She was going to be very icy. She was going to have these amazing cheekbones, this long blonde hair. Basically, Nico from the cover of Chelsea Girls. That was the Death that I had in my head. And then I got this drawing from Mike Dreienberg. The Sandman was still, I think, 3 or 4 months away from publication. Nobody knew what it was, but he just sent me this drawing, and it was Death and Dream. And he'd written on it, how would you feel about life if Death was your older sister? And I looked at that drawing and went, oh, she's that. Okay. And then the day that I got that, I showed it to Dave McKean, and then we went out for dinner. We'd gone to a meeting of the Society of Strip Illustrators, and we went to a pancake restaurant in London called My Old Dutch. And our waitress there was the drawing. which was really weird. She had the same long dark hair. She had the big ankh. She was dressed in black. She was American. Seemed very random in London, but there she was. And I kept saying to Dave, should I show her the drawing? And he was like, no, that's creepy and weird, and please don't. It's embarrassing. So I didn't. But it was like watching The Waitress, going, okay, that's death. This is who it is. And Mike Dringenberg made that happen. So absolutely. So like I said, it only happened once, but the one time it did, it changed everything.
And there's the Dringenberg death in the auction.
Absolutely.
You know, I have to say, this auction contains a piece from one of my favorite stories of yours, The Poison Ivy's Secret Origins. I have to say, I have always adored your treatment of DC's core heroes. I still maintain that the Superman Green Lantern Action Comics weekly finale story that you wrote is the greatest, is one of the 5 greatest DC stories ever told. But I think that Poison Ivy Secret Origins is such a profound piece in what was a fairly disposable series. I mean, I have them all, because I am a completist. But that one made me realize that this was something significant. And I've always wondered about that piece for you, about what it was about Poison Ivy and about the telling of that tale, because it is, you could interpret it as incredibly meta, especially the page that we have, right? It references Adam West, it references, all the other sort of, it's the history of Batman in a single page, quite frankly, as Poison Ivy narrates her love affair or love for Batman. But I've always wondered about that particular tale and what it meant for you in terms of your understanding of what you could do with legacy characters.
There is an alternate world in which I got to do all of my Batman projects, in which there's an alternate world in which Matt Wagner and I got to do our Superman story. It really, there's a lot of the stuff that happened and didn't happen that's luck. Sandman worked and nobody bothered me, and the luck for Sandman was always good. Whereas, that Action Comics story, it was published, 12 years after it was written, something right. Like that. It should have been out. I always feel if that Action Comics had happened, people would have gone, oh yes, we'll get Gaiman to write all of these superhero things. We'll give him Batman for a bit or whatever, and or Green Lantern or Superman, and it never came out, and nobody knew that I actually had enormous fun doing this. The Poison Ivy, I take a very, very peculiar pride in the fact that Poison Ivy is now one of DC Comics' big characters. And she wasn't. She was disposable and absolutely forgotten. And I loved the idea of putting Poison Ivy in my story. And that meant the world to me at the time. I thought, I love this character nobody else loves. And I did it later with the Riddler in the Secret Origin special. But that time, I thought, okay, well, I'll do things that can set up for Black Orchid. So that was, I think that Poison Ivy story may be the very first thing of mine ever to come out from DC Comics. I think it might have preceded Black Orchid by a week or two. One would have to go and look. But for me, the joy was just going, I love this character. I want to leave you with the same amount of joy and love that I have for this character. And I kind of feel like that started something, because I got to reshape her origin. The great thing about doing a Secret Origin, she had such a messy origin that she had like 5 or 6 competing origins, because nobody had ever bothered checking any of the previous ones. She had half a dozen names. So I just got to pick the ones I liked and got to decide that, and then that, and then weave Jason Woodrow in and build this thing for her that became her origin. And I kind of feel like, okay, good. I got to build her from there. And
it's funny.
Also,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Neil.
And Mark Buckingham, who is, for my money, still to this day, one of the most underrated great artists in comics. I feel like there will come a time when people will suddenly turn around and look at the body of Mark Buckingham's work and go, whoa, he did all that. He was amazing. And that was done by an incredibly young Mark Buckingham. He was, I think, 24, 25 when he drew that. And it was his, he did everything I asked him to do. It's like, hey, can you do this looking like it was drawn by, Carmine Infantino, inked by Joe Giella? I said, oh, sure.
Well, I know we've been at this about an hour, and we won't take up too much more time. But I do want to make sure that we cover a couple of things. The Christmas cards, the holiday cards that are in here.
Yeah.
I adore them. The prayers, the poems, they are very much, it's funny, we talk about if this auction does tell your story, then certainly these are some very intimate asides that were shared with friends, that were shared with family. These were not necessarily things meant for public consumption, although certainly people shared them and showed them to look what I got. Can you believe what I got? Oh my God, I got one of these Neil Gaiman poems and pieces. But talk about...
The weirdest thing is some of them have gone on to have other lives. Things that I began, my story, there is a book, a children's book, The Dangerous Alphabet, which exists because I wrote a Christmas card as an abecedary that I thought people would enjoy, tricksily swapping over the U and the V, and sent it out to friends. And one of those friends was my children's book editor, and she phoned me up and said, I want to make a book of this. So there's that. Nicholas Was, which is a 100-word short story, of which I'm still incredibly proud, began as this little thing that I wrote, and Dave McKean lettered and calligraphed beautifully. And I went and had some of them printed and sent out to friends, mostly because every Christmas I would get beautiful hand-drawn Christmas cards from friends who were artists. And every Christmas I would feel inferior. So I thought, right, I will get my revenge, people. I will absolutely, this is going to get out there. And then with all of these things, I do them every now and again when I feel like it. I'm terrible at doing them still to this day. I've managed this year to do a holiday. I printed up a photograph that I took a couple of years ago on the Isle of Skye of the night, and had them printed up beautifully. And I got all the ones out to England. The American ones, it's now February, and the American ones have not yet gone out. Maybe they will, and maybe they won't. Maybe they'll go out next year, but the Brits got their cards from me.
And the writer's prayer is obviously an incredibly important piece of, to me, it's a weird anchor to the entire auction.
I think it really is, and I love the fact that it's that basically is just the inside of my head.
Yeah,
it's the writer's prayer. It's like let me get this one right. I don't want to write too much. I don't want to write too little. I don't want to freeze. Just let me go, and with the truth in mind, let me write lies.
I'm incredibly honored to work at a place that we get to do this. When I came here 4 years ago, I had no idea what the auction world held for me. But if you had told me 4 years ago that, well, go to Heritage, you'll get to work with Neil Gaiman on an auction one day, I would have said, well, that's a pretty fair trade-off, especially given the fact that some proceeds from this auction will go to charity. Some will go to some of the artists with whom you've worked, who, have contributed to and made tangible your vision. And I assume that that was always going to be a part of the reason behind this auction.
I get to see Sandman pieces in particular going for enormous amounts of money these days. Unbelievable amounts of money. Monstrous, dare I say, obscene amounts of money. And I know that in a lot of cases, the artist sold them at the time for $100, $150 a page, gave them away, and here are these things that are going for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And some of my friends who drew Sandman a long time ago are old, frail. Some of them are working, some of them aren't. And I really liked the idea of being able to do that thing of giving back and going, okay, this thing you gave me, or in some cases I bought, but I bought for a pittance long, long ago, and I would like to be able to send you a nice healthy chunk of what it makes. So that for me was definitely one of the big drivers. I think for me that was the biggest difference between Jeff and his meteorites. With Jeff and his meteorites, he was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm in my 60s. I'm letting this stuff out, and I'm giving to charity. And for me, it was like, okay, I'm here. I'm in my 60s. I'm going to give to charity. But the thing that actually makes it even more exciting for me is that I have friends who I can go, here, have some money. Here's the thing that you made a long time ago, and I just want to give you this.
Everybody should be so fortunate to have a friend like that, Neil.
Well, thank you. It feels like a nice thing to do. It feels like a nice way to do it and to let the stuff out into the world. One of the things that was enormously fun, let me say this because you can cut it in anywhere, I'll just use it as a clip. One of the things that was great fun is I have a house in the Midwest, and it hasn't been my home for about 12 years now. 12, maybe 13 years. But it's still where I keep all my stuff. And my daughter lived there during COVID. I go, I stay there, I write, but it's not where I live anymore. And I had such a fun time last year going out there with a bunch of people from Heritage Auctions and just walking them around the house and saying, well, this is that, and watching their expressions as they saw what was hanging on the walls. And then watching their expressions as I took them into the attic. And I'm like, oh, here's a shelf, and these are all the statues I've got here, and this is all of this stuff. Partly because, my very first, when I was a baby author, 24 years old, and I got my copies of my Duran Duran book, and I got my copies of Ghastly Beyond Belief, and I gave them all away to friends. I have my books of 25 of each of them, and everything went out to friends. And a few years later, I'm looking around and I don't have copies of Ghastly Beyond Belief or Duran Duran, and both of them are now going for enormous amounts of money. And I thought, I should keep stuff. I should actually, if this happens again, I'll hold on to some of the stuff. So stuff would come through, and I wouldn't give it all away. I'd always make sure I kept 3 or 4 of whatever it was on one side. But then there's also a point when you're, in your 60s and you're going, yes, I have variant copies of Sandman 8 sitting here. I'm like, what good are they doing in the basement of this? Here, let me send some copies of Sandman 8 variant, of Sandman 18 variant of these things out into the world.
I was very envious when I heard that I had colleagues who were crawling around with your permission, with you, around your stuff. I just thought, well, I'll get to talk to him somewhere down the road about this auction, but I still felt like I had missed out on a remarkable opportunity.
They had so much fun. That was actually, there was a lot of, in fact, there were several times when we would pass things, right? Go, oh yeah, that's so-and-so. And they'd be like, can we have it? Can we have it for the auction? I'm like, what, you think someone wanted it? I mean, yeah, I guess. Got 3 of them, sure, I have one. And so there was a certain amount of that, as well as the awe and amazement and joy they would have.
Well, there's nothing like watching somebody, it's the reflected joy, right? It's what it means to you, but watching somebody else tell you how much it means to them is why you do it.
Exactly. And there are pieces in this auction. Just behind you, you've got the Coraline stop motion puppet that I was given by LAIKA. It's Coraline. She's got the cat in her bag. She's in her pajamas. I've had her now for 15 years. And I look at her every day and go, I love you. You're beautiful. But I also am so aware that Coraline, the movie, has become this huge cultural phenomenon that has nothing to do with me in its own magical way. It's you've got generations of kids who've now grown up on the movie. You've got adults who come over to me and explain that either I was responsible for their love of horror or I was responsible for decades of therapy. And Coraline is this thing, and I'm like, okay, you should go out and go make these people incredibly happy. Having said that, I did not get rid of the Coraline maquette. The first thing that they ever sent me was a painted maquette of Coraline before her hair was blue. In the very first one they sent me, she still had brown hair. They hadn't blued her hair yet. And she's staying with me. She'll be with me when I die.
I would assume so. And look, it's incredibly beautiful signed copies of American Gods. I mean, look, we have barely begun in the course of this conversation to scratch the surface of everything that's here. I think we've certainly hit upon some of the highlights, personal and otherwise. I'm just heartbroken. There's nothing from the day I swapped my dad for 2 goldfish, but that's another conversation for another day.
There isn't. One reason for that is that I held on to the vast majority of the Dave McKean stuff. I let a few pages go from Black Orchid, but Dave McKean art means so much to me. There were things where I had the heritage people saying, you own the cover of the original Doll's House collection. And I'm like, yes, here it is on the wall. They're saying, can we auction it? I'm like, no. That's it.
I would hope not. I'm not going to lie. There's certain things that I would insist that you hold on to. That would be one of them.
And
The Day I Swapped My Dad for 2 Goldfish was simply my son's favorite book for about 3 years of his life. So we had to read it every night for 3 years.
That is the thing about being a children's author that you have to think about when you're writing a children's book. Because when you're writing a book for adults, you go, this may be read once. Maybe if the adult lives long enough, they'll read it 3 or 4 times during the course of their lifetime. I'm writing a children's book. this may get read twice a day by the same adult for a couple of years, and I need to make it fun for the adult. I need to give them sentences that will be fun to say. I need some jokes that are just in there for the adult, because to let them know it's okay. And I know they're going to be reading this and rereading this and rereading this.
Well, as much as I've read everything you've written, that's the thing I have read the most by far. I appreciate this, man. I can't. You're going to be here for the auction?
That's the plan. I've worked out childcare. I'm going to fly in the day before, do the thing, and I'll be there.
I think you and I are going to do a live conversation.
Awesome. Well, that'll also be fun, because we can talk about the specific things.
Right. We'll have everything lined up, and we can just walk through the gallery, and you can talk about every piece.
Talk about where I got things from, why, what I remember about it.
Yeah. We'll just walk through the gallery, and we'll do you won't even need me. You may just do it yourself.
I'm sure that there will be a certain amount of point me at something, and I will go blah, 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 blah. But also, it's almost fun to do one of these things with people who actually want to know. And, where you can point out the absolute, ask me a question about the, what is this piece? Why was I given it? Who gave it?
We'll talk about your Comics Buyers Award we haven't even talked about yet.
It's funny. That was one of those things where the heritage people said, can we have an award? Can I have some awards? And I'm like, sure. I have so many awards. I love the idea of just getting to put, and there are some awards where you go, I don't think I meant to sell these or let them out. The Hugo and the Nebula, and
sure,
those are probably going to be, but they're those kind of things where my kids, when I'm dead, will be going, I wish you'd sold them. I mean, what do we do with them? So
it's a big ass paperweight.
Huge, but I have, because you will not run out of papers. There are so many awards, and but I loved the idea of at least letting a few of them back into the world.
Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this. I'm thrilled to be part of this auction. I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, few weeks. It'll be a big event. I'm thrilled about it, and I can't wait to see what you add to the catalog as well.